So my guest on today's show is Jen Briselli. Hello, Jen. Jen works at the intersection of experience, strategy, service design, systems thinking, and learning science. She's the co-founder, Principle Experience Strategist at Topology. She's an assistant professor of design innovation at Mass Art. She's also been an adjunct professor at Northeastern University and formerly chief design strategy officer at MadPow. Jen's a gifted writer, science communicator, soon to be metal drummer, I believe. She is not a problem solver, but a generalist, enabler of others. Jen Briselli, so excited to have you on the show and appreciate you taking the time to othermind with me.
My
Welcome.
pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. There's so much I am so excited to talk to you about. I want to start with a quote from a recent thing you wrote on Medium, which struck me. So systems thinking in complexity science can offer an approach to the most challenging design endeavors we face today, and will arguably be one of the most critical disciplines for design strategists and other agents of change in the coming decades. I was wondering if you could like expound on that a little bit. From when I read that, I was like, "Oh my
Back
gosh,
it up.
that's so exciting." Let's work our way into that. Like, you said, you could argue that that would be one of the most important disciplines or learning. So, what do you mean by that?
Probably two things. One is that it's my personal opinion that those are the skills that are going to be most useful for
Yep.
designers. And I think for the purposes of today, we should say that by design, I mean broadly design
Hmm.
practice. So
Yep.
strategy, experience, design, innovation, all that good stuff. I assume anybody watching or listening is going to know that it's not just the aesthetic version of design.
Hmm.
Um, but I think that that's a skill set that's going to be increasingly critical because most of the types of work that designers are going to do is going to move further and further upstream.
Hmm.
So you got to be able to deal with complex, messy problems. And then I think the other reason that I would make this argument is that most of the problems that we as a species are going to become increasingly committed to solving for, I don't know, our own survival are going to
Hmm.
require the kind of interconnected systems views that these types of skills are going to, be critical for. So as
Yeah.
people talk and hear more about regenerative societies and economies and the circular economy, and I think growing interest and attention on solving some of the challenges of climate change and creating more sustainable practices, doing that with a very conventional myopic lens on individual channels or streams or products or services isn't going to not just be ineffective, like it's going to be a waste of time. So if you're a designer, you should
Hmm.
be picking up some of these skills and maybe adjusting your mindset to match is probably the more important part.
Yeah, I was thinking like, it could be like, is it possible systems thinking and design in that broad sense is almost like people are beginning to pick up on it as almost like a survival instinct? Like, I've got to learn these things in order to make do.
I mean, as hard as it is to say, I hope so.
Yeah.
I think our survival depends on it as a species, as a profession,
Mm.
and as individuals. I mean, at the individual level, I think there's probably a level of fear in some folks around skills that are going to be replaced by AI or other automated systems. Even
Yeah.
without AI in the picture, if you look at the last 10 to 15 years of design in terms of UX and UI design, it's no longer the Wild West that it used to be. There are a lot more best practices
Yep.
and systems and patterns that we can rely on. So that is how fields evolve and disciplines change over time. So on an individual practitioner level, for sure, it's a self-preservation move, if nothing else.
Mm.
And then again, as a larger kind of community of humans, trying to find a space in the planetary ecosystem that like lets us stay here is
Yeah.
going to be pretty critical to see our role in those systems. And I think more and more people are waking up to that.
Yeah, it does seem like I had written down like in my notes preparing for this, I was like, is systems thinking the new black? Like, I feel like I don't know if the algorithm got me or if this is the echo chamber of the internet, or if this is actually like it's a thing I heard every once in a while on the periphery only a few years ago. It feels like now it's COVID time, so maybe it was a decade ago.
Yeah.
Um, but is this also like something that's popping up for you that seems like more and more people are talking about these ideas?
Yeah, I think it's kind of hit a bit of a critical mass, which, for better or for worse, systems thinking and a lot of the sort of adjacent and associated ideas is it's absolutely having a moment. And there, if you hear a tone of snark in that. It's there by a little amount because I can also predict the trajectory that the phrase systems thinking is probably going to follow, which
Yep.
is new and interesting, not all that well understood to a lot of people. It's not new as a field, let's get that
Right.
straight. But to a lot of people, it's new. And it's going to become something that everybody wants to start tacking on to things. So you don't have to look very far to see where, for example, IDEO has their human-centered systems thinking course like
Mm-hmm.
plastered everywhere, you know. So everybody is definitely converging around this idea. The speed at which they're doing it varies depending on where you're looking. And I will just say that I fully expect systems thinking to follow the trajectory that design thinking did,
Mm.
which was everybody was first really big on it and then expected it to do everything and solve everything. And of course, it becomes such a watered down, weird thing that it becomes meaningless. And then there's a little bit of backlash. So in like
Yeah.
2 years, when everyone's like, "Ugh, systems thinking has totally jumped the shark," I will be heartbroken. But at least
Mm.
for right now, I think it's a great opportunity for the awareness that people are building around the fact that there is a rigorous means by which we can look at broader systems and not
Mm.
lose touch with what's on the ground. And that study and that discipline will exist, has existed, will continue to exist even when the phrase gets kind of ruined, um,
Yeah.
by the people who ruin it for profit.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, we'll enjoy the glow up for now. You're saying systems thinking is having its moment, so we'll allow it to have its moment. Um, I do wonder, thinking, I know you've done a good amount of kind of educating or mentoring experienced strategists and designers. So I'd love to eventually get into where systems thinking falls short and when it's not an appropriate tool for the situation you're in. But for new people getting into the field or folks who are interested in this idea,
Mhm.
what's like the pitch? Like, what's the relevance in today's context for
Yeah.
learning more? Yeah.
I think in general, and I know that I say this in a lot of places, but one of the phrases that gets bandied about a lot in relation to systems thinking, and I think it originated with Peter Senge and some of his writing, but I don't know for sure.
Hmm.
But it's this notion that cause and effect are often farther apart in space and time than we think it is, or we realize it is. So if you're a designer who is working on something that is a very narrow focus and everything about it has already been established, maybe systems thinking isn't relevant for you. You know, it's
Hmm.
because this is it, man. You're trying to figure out whether this button should be up 2 pixels or left 2 pixels.
Right.
Like you don't need systems thinking. You need the other forms of UI and UX design and perception and neuroscience and all of that.
Hmm.
But if you're a person, design practitioner or otherwise, and all the humans who don't have titles like designer but are doing design the way we talk about it, if you find yourself every once in a while being frustrated by the fact that you're kind of focused on this particular agent or element or component, a product, a service, a human segment, a group of people, and you start to realize like you can make all the changes you want within that little window, but that there's stuff happening over here that is really affecting the experience and it sort of feels out of reach, or that people
Yeah.
aren't paying attention to the thing over there. When you start to realize like something's happening over there that matters, that's where systems thinking has is valuable. That's where it becomes something that I think any practitioner of any kind of design or similar craft can benefit from, having a good understanding of how to zoom out and think about a system. And really, it's not that there's a specific method or a tool. There are certain tools and modeling and mapping methods in the system sciences, and there's a million subdisciplines, and they each kind of have their own things. But really, it's just at its highest level, figuring out how to zoom out, widen that aperture, and
Hmm.
and to develop the skills and build the muscles to look for what's happening between, like in the negative spaces between the components of a system. So if we talk about human-centered design, which is wonderful because
Yeah.
it represents a departure of what came before, which was not very human-centered, didn't think much about the humans on the other end of an experience. But sometimes it can be a little bit of a too much of a good thing where we focus on the human and we lose sight of the fact that there are these systemic factors and structural factors around them that influence that experience. And if you change something over here,
Hmm.
as I gesture wildly off to the distance,
Yeah. Yeah.
actually really materially affect the experience or the outcome of the humans way over there that you're trying to impact. So to that end, in that cause and effect being far apart in space and time,
Hmm.
what systems thinking and a lot of the associated sort of resources and tools from that world might help you with is how to find out how to link those things by looking either farther apart in space or
Hmm.
looking farther apart in time, right? Looking further upstream to understand the influences, and also looking downstream or into the future using the tools of futures thinking and strategic foresight.
Mm.
So if you're a person who's interested in this, there are a lot of nice, easy kind of entry points into it. It doesn't need to be this super, esoteric, crazy, abstract, study of dynamical systems or like complexity or network science or any of that. But that's all awesome.
Yeah.
Do that.
Yeah. Yeah.
But you
Right.
can start off with a couple very popular, books and resources that are designed for lay people. So that's my
Yeah.
pitch.
Yeah, no, I love that. One of the interesting, like as I've been thinking more and more about it, the idea that it almost feels like there's a, and tell me if I'm thinking about this in if there's a better way to think about it, but the idea of like specialization and that whole everything that came after the Enlightenment or the Industrial Revolution and
Yeah.
everything getting more and more specific. I feel like maybe even you wrote about it at some point, but you reach this hard wall where suddenly it reveals itself that you could go deep, deep, deep into a thing and think you're knowing more and more about a specific situation. But at a certain point, that breaks down and complexity reveals itself to you inevitably. Is that like so? It feels like there's almost a relationship between this ideas of typical, like your scientific thinking and systems thinking and specialization and a more generalist approach. Is there some,
Yeah,
yeah,
I think so. And I mean, there's certainly not, systems thinking versus, I guess, I don't want to suggest there's necessarily like a diametrically opposed relationship here
yep,
between like systems thinking and something else, but put it in contrast with like analytical thinking that seeks to break things apart to understand them better.
yep,
And that in and of itself is not bad. We need specialist knowledge about specific things. But to your point, there are a lot of really smart humans who have made that point elegantly, that if you follow that far enough, you do end up inside a silo. And that where I think it does marry with that concept of being specialist versus generalist. And I hate the word generalist. It's kind of had a bad reputation over the years. Yeah, it's come back around. There's more books lately about the power of being a generalist. People are trying to rebrand it like expert generalist, which like
yeah,
or polymath. Polymath is a good term.
yep.
I've learned recently another term that's multi-potentialite, I think.
Okay, all right.
Okay, I like that one. But the idea really not necessarily being that it doesn't need to be like, hey, I'm on team generalists and all you specialists suck. It just means that I think our last, 200 years has really, really driven us in the direction of not just analytical thinking, but following that to a fault where it becomes reductionist thinking. And
Mm,
and because of that, all of the incentives that exist for people who study and or want to make good on the knowledge we build as humans, all the incentives exist for them to do it within those specialty silos, and very few incentives and many disincentives for doing them across silos and connecting across disciplines. And we get more and more of that these days. Of course, things, there's a lot of focus on becoming more cross disciplinary and interdisciplinary and
yep,
transdisciplinary. And I know you've heard me say, I don't even like those. I want post disciplinary, or some people use the term anti disciplinary. Like, I don't care
yep,
what you call it, but it's how to become, sort of in that way, not just linking these separate silos, but actually allowing them to cross over each other. And so
yeah,
I do think a generalist or trans or post disciplinary approach goes hand in hand with systems thinking, because systems view is looking at all of the pieces and parts.
yeah,
And then it's almost like, I think about it like putting different lenses on things. If you're thinking about like a light behind stage, if you're a drama person and you put the different colored gel filters over, like,
yeah,
okay, now I can put this filter over everything in this system and look at it from a learning perspective. Now I can put a behavior one over it and look at it from a behavior perspective. Now I can put another one over it and look at it from information flow. Because one of the
yeah,
values of systems thinking that maybe would have been more relevant in the previous answer, but most people, designers in particular, are really thinking about components and the stuff of systems,
yeah.
and even if it's not physically a product, but a digital experience, the humans involved. But we aren't, as humans, naturally doing as much of the thinking of what is flowing between them. And so
Mm,
that's where a systems view helps to illuminate what's flowing between the parts. Is it money? Is it the perception of value? Is it power? Is it information? Is it literally energy? A lot of systems
mm,
is. So being a generalist, I think, does go hand in hand with being able to take a systems view and then identify points in the system where you see connections that you wouldn't see if you were taking a very analytical, piece by piece, part by part reductionist look.
yeah. You talk about systems thinking being a rich ground for like metaphors. A couple like as you're talking about it, I'm reminded of like if you go see a piece like real fine art and you stand up close to it, it's gonna be complete. It's gonna be nothing. It's gonna be nothing to you until you stand away and
Yep.
allow the broader picture to take in. Or like even I'm a musician as well, so the idea of studying a song by just looking at the individual notes with being completely blinded to the potential harmonies or discord between them. So yeah, that whole zooming out, I think, is really interesting, especially in a time like now. I'm wondering like if we could go back a little bit, set some background around how we got here. It does feel like this is a bit of a paradigm shift, right, in how we see things or view the world or imagine our role or position within a world. So, yeah, I know, and you recently wrote an article in defense of synergy, which I loved. Great, check out Jen's Medium if you aren't familiar with it. Um, and in that, you talked about this kind of change of what I think you called it like a change in gravity or gravitational center or something like that, right? And the move from the Copernican revolution into it. So I'd love like maybe just a little, if you could provide some background for folks here. What is the paradigm that's currently in place? How did we get there? And where are things moving? Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm there are people who've studied this in far more depth than me,
Yeah.
historians of science, philosophers of science. So, but at its highest level, um, as humans, like from the dawn of whenever we first existed, gathering knowledge and figuring out ways of sharing it has been pretty critical to our survival.
Mhm.
And then, of course, as that information increases, finding really effective ways to both store and continue to share it, but also to divide it, like to divvy it up and to make it accessible when we need it. So whether it was through storytelling and the natural kind of wiring of our brains to follow narrative structures and to really find and engage with information in that way through oral traditions and such, eventually getting to this point where whether you want to think about it as like during the scientific revolution or the industrial revolution and other periods in time, we've really, I don't want to blame one guy, but I am
Uh,
not the world's biggest fan of Frederick Taylor,
okay.
who was a guy that basically advanced the concept of scientific management. He's to
Mm.
me not really like the problem, but he's such a good like figurehead representation of where I think we got ourselves stuck on a path that was suddenly very hard to divert course from. And it was really about that same analytical chunk things out, take them apart, and understand the system by looking at the parts. And that is effective for certain kinds of systems. And he was applying that kind of thinking to the actual management of humans and work and labor. And when he did that, he was basically able to say, if we take every action that a human does and optimize every piece of it down to like as the tiniest like 2 seconds of like some kind of action a human takes, what we can then do is just multiply that efficiency over all the number of components and the scale of the things in the system. And that had a lot of influence that still we all still live in today around the way that things are optimized and the way that we apply a very analytical approach to understanding systems. And I should say system, which we haven't defined,
Yeah.
is something that we just draw boundaries around. It includes human, non-human, tangible and non-tangible things. It's all the stuff you've heard me mention, right? So the components or the actors or the stuff, as well as the non-tangible things that flow around. And where you draw the boundaries around a system is dependent on who you are and what you're trying to do and understand.
Yeah.
So anyway, what I'm getting to here is that kind of thinking suddenly became a very, very appealing way of doing everything in this country and in the Western world more broadly, because it did have very, very strong, like positive effects on optimization and profitability and the kind of
Right.
things that people were very much looking to accomplish. And it then at the same time served to distance us from that system's view. And it was fine because most of the systems that he was applying that logic to were the kind of systems where if you take the pieces apart, optimize each piece, you're fine.
Yeah.
But there are a lot of systems where if you take the system apart, you can look at the pieces, but the pieces don't tell you what the system actually accomplishes. I mean, and take a car, for example. Like a car you could take apart you could look at each of the parts and identify the parts and understand them and optimize them. You put them together and the car is going to run in an optimized way and you understand what the car does. But
Mm.
there are a lot of systems that when you take the pieces and parts apart, they don't tell you what the system as a whole does, like the human body or a lot of
Right.
natural systems where, organisms in an ecosystem work together and you can understand them in isolation. But even if you change something of one in isolation, you don't know how that change is going to propagate through the rest of the system. So long story short, that's
Yeah.
the history lesson. If you want to blame somebody, I guess it's all right to blame Frederick Taylor, but don't. There's so
Yeah.
much more to the story. But we basically found ourselves kind of in a very reinforcing feedback loop telling us take things apart to understand them,
Yeah.
and we lost the ability to put them back together. And so that paradigm shift, and I do like the metaphor of when we used to think the sun or the earth was at the center of the universe.
Yeah.
I think we're just in the midst of a bit of a paradigm shift for humans to kind of understand we lost the ability to look at systems as a whole because we've incentivized ourselves to do the opposite. And so increasingly, I think that's why there's so much energy around systems thinking, because it's a way of solving so many of these problems that have escaped analytical thinking. Our
Mm.
best analytical methods haven't solved social inequality or
Mhm.
hunger or climate change.
Yeah.
So people, I think, are grasping for a different way. And we've separated ourselves so much from the systems that we are part of,
Yeah.
meaning man versus nature or man versus social systems. We've done such a good job of taking things apart that we have forgotten even the systems that we're part of. So that's why I find it's becoming, I think, more appealing to folks to approach things in this way.
Yeah. No, I would also imagine so, and hope so. I think like in our first conversation, we talked a little bit about Thomas Kuhn and the nature of scientific revolutions and how new paradigms come into being or accepted. Usually, that's not like a pretty thing. Like it's a little messy in between times and in between paradigms. Often, I would imagine people try not to, or it would be the preference to avoid changing a paradigm. It seems
Yeah. You know what's worth
inconvenient.
mentioning here too, if
Yeah,
any of
yeah,
the listeners aren't familiar with it, is
yeah.
the adaptive cycle. There's a framework called the adaptive cycle, and then
Hmm.
sometimes also with it the Panarchy model, which is really a model, an understanding of how systems and paradigms change. And it was really built around an understanding of ecological systems, but
Hmm.
it has turned out to be widely applicable to all kinds of systems, all kinds of complex adaptive systems, not just an ecosystem in this region and these animals and these plants and these flora fauna, but also social human systems and neighborhoods, things like that. And what that adaptive cycle really says, it's literally like an infinity symbol, and it's just effectively outlining the process by which this change can happen. And it does include very familiar phases, comfortable phases like growth, and
Yep.
then maintenance or conservation once we reach something that feels like we can conserve and maintain. But then eventually it moves through a phase of what is often called release in the model, but I often think of it more as like disintegration. Things get
Yeah.
messy, things get uncomfortable. Stuff happens that is not desirable, but it's the natural process of a system reaching a point where it can't sustain itself in the form that it's in. Growth isn't possible anymore, nor is even a sustainable level of maintenance, because of the way that time and things shift, and the incentives of a system and the
Mm.
movement dynamics of a system. So you move through that phase of disintegration, which I think a lot of things are moving through right now on a
Yeah.
societal level. But then
Yeah.
after that, it comes back around to what's usually called reorganization, into new, reorganizing into new ways of thinking, new
Mm.
paradigms, new mental models. And then that word panarchy comes into play because that process from, starting at a point, growth, expanding, eventually kind of conserving, maintaining for a while, then disintegrating, and then moving back through reorganizing the pieces into something new.
Mm.
Imagining that
Yep.
repeating over and over again and at different scales. Imagining that happening for like humanity in general, but then also imagine that happening in your local community. And then imagine that happening to you, your
Yeah.
life. Like, what is that like on a human individual level? Those nested kind of versions of the model over different scales and over different time frames is what the panarchy term is referring to. So if that's compelling to anybody listening, I highly recommend reading about it, because there's so many good thoughts, and there's, as you mentioned earlier, it's a great metaphor. If
Yeah.
you stop at the metaphor, it's a wonderful metaphor for making meaning about the way that systems adjust and move and evolve over time. but it's also more than a metaphor. There's actually very good
Mm.
studies and evidence that this is actually something that is measurable and observable, and you can quantify in some cases, depending on the type of system, that this is
Yeah.
what systems do.
Yeah, I am familiar with that and it's one of my favorites that I've ever found as something that continues to come back as a useful tool for. I've even thought of it as a really useful tool for just mapping where are we potentially at right now in the
Yeah.
story. Are we on the like upward, up and up? We're climbing and growing and everything's great. Are we like, and the word disintegrating, I love it. So disintegrating, like the
Mhm.
integration is no longer, everything's freed up.
Yeah.
Um, I had heard you talking, I think it was maybe with Gary David, about the idea as design as almost like a metabolism that comes into a field or into an industry and helps to put things back together or together in different ways. I'm wondering, like, just hearing you
Yeah.
talk about this adaptive cycle, a lot of things we're in right now feel like maybe we're at the top of the roller coaster and things are starting to come down. I wonder if that is in fact the case, if that could be another reason why ideas like systems thinking and design are
Yeah.
surfacing.
I think so. And I think because people are it's obviously, again, human nature to want to make sense of things as they're happening.
Yeah.
And people are kind of grasping for the tools or the lenses or the mental models that make sense of this. I mean, in a lot of ways, this ties into, I know I've talked to you a
Mm,
little bit about transformative learning theory and other forms of learning. We can come back around to that, but
right.
this is what we are experiencing right now, even I would call a disorienting dilemma, which is a term that Jack Mezirow uses in his framework around transformative learning theory. And that notion of something happening that goes really against our mental schema of how the world works. And
Mm,
as a human, we experience those on all kinds of scales all the time. And usually what happens is we either figure out a way to fit it into our existing schema and make just small nudges or adjustments to our schema to accommodate it, or
yep.
it like breaks our schema. And that I often think can also be akin to like traumatic experiences, right? How
Sure.
some people can have an experience that they find traumatic and somebody else can have the same experience, and they, instead of experiencing PTSD, they
Mm,
experience something called post-traumatic growth. And
right.
they're not mutually exclusive. I mean, but all of these things start to overlap for me. So as far as designers and systems thinking, these are the ways of working and meaning making that are not tied to a specific subject matter. That's the
Mm,
key, right? And it ties back to a very generalist way of thinking. These are the ways of approaching and making meaning out of stuff that is effectively like blowing our minds or like messing up our mental models. And these tools are effective because you don't have to have a specific subject matter in which they apply. Design is
right.
kind of inherently without its own subject matter, at least design in the bigger sense that I like, I'm talking about it.
Yeah.
And the same thing is true of systems thinking. I mean, if you follow any kind of journals and resources and the different types of papers and studies and work that come out in systems thinking, you've got people applying these various subdisciplines within systems thinking to ant colonies, to global economies, to earthquake prediction, and that's the beauty of that. Design doesn't need to have a subject matter expertise, but designers are naturally, I think, kind of attuned to being able to work across different settings and systems. And so as we are reaching for like, oh my God, my mental schema as an individual and as humans,
Yeah.
like, is kind of disintegrating and things are changing in very uncomfortable ways. These are the kind of tools that I think we're reaching for that reason. So I definitely agree.
Well, this show's meant to be about learning in public, me learning. And so this is like, I guess I'm grasping at straws too. I'm just one of the many people looking
Me
to
too.
figure things out and make sense. So these tools, a lot of the stuff you're talking about, I find super helpful in just navigating what feels like, what I think certainly is increasing complexity across
Yeah.
a bunch of different fronts, both in everyday life as human beings trying to live life on planet Earth, but also people in business and organizations trying to make sense, make better decisions, make meaningful change.
Yeah.
Really helpful. One of the maybe knock-on effects or secondary consequences of these new ways of thinking or of paradigm shifts I've found is that it seems like maybe in thinking about the world differently, maybe we start to think about ourselves differently. Like, do the metaphors, I was thinking earlier this morning, do the metaphors change? Like the brain used to be like this perfect logic machine, like a computer or a thing. And now it's like, well, the brain is nothing without a body, and the body's nothing without the world. So it's like an embodied mind, brain, body that is, yeah.
Yeah, you're getting into this is, I mean, I love, this could be another 3-hour conversation, I'm
Sure.
sure.
Well, we'll book
But
it after this.
I
Yeah.
definitely just take very simply even the metaphor of machine versus organic. You know, that's everywhere right now and for good
Hmm.
reason. Like, listen, why is that signal so loud? People are like,
Yeah.
we can't treat organizations as machines. We can't treat the brain as a machine. We can't treat our world as a machine. It's an organic, and like people are, you know, on one hand, I'm like thrilled to see this. And on the other hand, I'm like, yeah, no kidding. You're telling me that tree's not a machine. No, duh.
Yeah, right.
Sometimes it's kind of that, as an educator and as someone who taught actual like high school physics for years before I moved into physics or to design, I know learning involves revisiting, very fractal process, revisiting self-similar
Mm,
patterns over and over again, and what can feel like you're going in circles and arriving back at the same point and rediscovering the same old thing. People have seen, I'm sure, those like, you know, illustrations. It's not a circle because if you look at it from the side, it's actually a spiral and you're going
yeah,
up,
right,
you know,
right.
like whatever cutesy metaphor aside, that's true here. So people are like rediscovering or re-remembering that the machine metaphor is not really effective for the types of systems and problems that we are really struggling to solve. And more organic metaphors like gardening and tending and facilitating rather than, you
Hmm.
know, leveraging and managing and manipulating. And it's kind of the difference between, we don't have to get into too many of the esoteric kind of distinct differences between, say, complex systems and complicated systems or chaotic
Yeah,
systems, but understanding that there are differences between those if you want to use the more formalized words, and that a complex system is not a system that acts like a machine. That if you could magically predict all the individual parts of a complex system, you still can't
right.
predict the actual behavior of the system, because the
Mhm.
system as a whole accounts for agents or things inside of it that have agency, that can make
Right,
decisions on their own. And so therefore they introduce a level of uncertainty, not randomness, not totally random, but a
right.
level of uncertainty that you cannot acutely predict in a way that our old fashioned models would want us to predict and then plan and then so on. So, you know, I love that like we're getting away from machine and more towards organic as far as metaphors go. But I will add, as like a bit of a side note, I see that so much that I'm like, we're overdoing that metaphor, everybody, because there are still machines. We've
Yeah.
invented machines, they exist, and so they are in the world. And I find that what goes like in the handbasket with that metaphor is that there's also this, maybe there's a tension between the concept of hierarchies and more egalitarian networks.
Mm,
I don't think those are one to one. Like a machine isn't a hierarchy, and an organic, you know, system is not necessarily an egalitarian network. But I think people kind of tie them together in that way. And for good reason, because a lot of the things we model in a mechanistic way and a deterministic system way, there are hierarchies. That's what makes it easy to predict and control what happens.
yep.
Versus in organic systems, they are more egalitarian in the sense that they are networks that have lots of different links and flows, and it's not a hierarchy. So I understand why. But with that has come this kind of like all hierarchies are bad sort of mentality.
Right.
And like 99% of the time, I'm right there. Like I'm here for anarchy in the philosophical sense of the word, not the
Hmm.
throw bricks through windows, although that's part of
Right.
the thing sometimes too. But I'm here for the, we can get by without hierarchies, like structural, you know, crystallized hierarchies are, I think,
Yep.
are largely bad for a lot of the innovation we're going to need to see in the coming century.
Yep.
But not all hierarchies are bad. There are a lot of good examples throughout history and in nature where natural organic hierarchies emerge, serve a purpose, serve a
Hmm.
function, and then go away. You could almost say a hierarchy forms like following that adaptive cycle. And then at the end, it, instead of reorganizing, one of the little options in that cycle has something just go away. And so that's,
Yeah. Yeah.
so anyway, that was my little
That's like a
aside.
systems way of looking at hierarchies, though, right? Because you can, a hierarchy is almost a snap. It's a snapshot from a reductionist standpoint.
Right,
Like you could
right,
just take a snapshot of a, but if you're doing the whole, I love the way you're talking about you. It's zooming out both in potentially space and time, and
right,
if you do that far enough with a hierarchy, it dismantles itself
exactly.
after it serves its purpose.
Right, right. And I can't help but think about this with a physicist's brain, but you know, we want to, especially because you started to talk about like embodied brain and mind and stuff.
Yep.
So much of what we think about it linearly because our brains are wired to do that, and also because we learn from a very young age to think that way, even in subjects like math and science where time flows one way. Yeah,
Yeah.
or does it? Or
Mm.
does it, right? So if you're at all a fan of anything in modern physics, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that's actually not how time works. And time and
Right.
space aren't actually things. So I guess if anybody wants actually to read some really, really good, like
Yeah. What's a
philosophical
recommendation?
stuff, there's a book called Meeting the Universe Halfway by Karen Barad, Barad, I'm pretty sure.
Mm.
And this is a work of very esoteric. You've probably got to have at least either some knowledge of physics or at least the ability to tolerate it. You don't have
Hmm.
to have the knowledge to understand it, but I could see people getting bored with some of it.
Yep.
But this is a work of philosophy. And she, I believe actually her pronouns are they. So they lay out a philosophy called agential realism.
Hmm.
But the idea is that nothing exists outside of some kind of intra action between it and other things. And
Yeah.
I know that sounds like we're getting like a little woo woo, but I actually think it's just a beautiful kind of like a, accompaniment to everything we are talking about, even though they don't talk about systems thinking in this book. It is really more a work of like postmodern philosophy, I think.
Yeah.
But I find it very complementary to all of these conversations. And so if anybody can work their way through it, I
Yeah.
loved it, but I have a weird intersection of disciplinary background that I know that not everybody would have, or find like a summary or a companion reader for it,
Yeah.
because it might help kind of adjust your own mental model around things that accompany everything we're talking about today.
That sounds fascinating. And I would say I welcome the woo woo. I welcome the
Good.
woo woo here. So that sounds, yeah, it reminds me of some of these ideas like, I don't know if it's like structural coupling or, what is it? Not symbiopoiesis. Is that it?
Yeah.
Is that the
Yeah.
word? As
That's
opposed
yep.
to autopoiesis?
Yep.
That, yeah, coming
Very much.
together. And yeah.
Yep. And she's doing it with the backdrop of quantum physics, which again, you don't need to have a background in it. She walks through it.
Good.
But it was so interesting because she really is, she's kind of using the work of Niels Bohr, who's one
Okay.
of the quantum physics folks, to kind of put a backdrop for and as almost a metaphor for the way that what happens in quantum physics, where things come into and out of existence purely in relation to each other, but using that as kind of a metaphor for broader senses of existence.
Oh God. I love it. I'm already excited about that.
Let me know how you like it.
Well, I might have to use you as you'll be my interpreter. I'll be
I
like,
would
Jane,
love
what
to
the
run a
hell is
book
this?
club on this book, but I have yet to really find people who want to raise their hand for it. So maybe as a
This could be
function of
it.
this,
This
yeah,
could
if
be it.
people want to do this as a book club, I would love that.
I like it. We're gonna put a pin in that one. I like it. So let's get. I want to get back to this like systems thinking. I'm just gonna pull up
Yeah,
a slide of a thing that I found in one of your presentations. It was this confusogram of all the different. Yeah, it was on the resilience.org. Brief
yes,
history of system science chaos
yep,
in complexity. So I was just hoping, like, okay, there's a few different. Someone's somewhat new to this world.
yeah,
Obviously, there's a few different general species or genera somewhere in here. So, like, could you just like,
yeah.
what are the different languages and words and names for
Sure.
things? Yeah,
Yeah,
we don't have to
and
go into all of these,
no, 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 I won't. I
obviously.
wouldn't even
Yeah,
do it if you wanted me to.
yeah,
And this is I think hopefully folks will know, like, this I didn't create this chart. It is from that
yeah.
resilience.org article, and I can't remember the author's name. It might be Daniel Wall, but we should give him proper credit. But
We'll
either
give him proper
way,
credit.
this is a nice way to illustrate, not with the intention of actually looking at each of those circles, but just to see how kind of messy this is. Because when people use the term systems thinking, there is, first of all, there's systems thinking, there's system science,
Hmm.
there's all these other words, and like, which one is it? Why do we use one versus another? And then within that, there are all these subdisciplines, and trying to map both the history, the initial definition and initiation of it, and then where it goes and intersects. I'll just say this, like, this is one map. You could make 18 other maps that are probably just as accurate, and they're all
Hmm.
messy. So the headline for anybody should really be, know that there are a lot of subdisciplines, and know that a lot of these subdisciplines have largely just different lenses or focus areas as far as what they're trying to understand. So one of the things I like to point out to people is a lot of the origin story of systems thinking and systems science is around general systems theory,
Hmm.
which was kind of like the early, and there again, there's different names for that. So somebody else will prefer to call it something different, but that originated kind of in the 40s. There's a little bit of a, earlier tale to some of these, but it really at that time was a way of trying to think about, are there principles or universal truths about systems, like period, regardless of what kind of system? Are there like
Mm.
universal truths about the behavior of systems? And it was a lot like similar to in physics, the like search for a theory of everything, that combines like the standard model of particles, combines relativity with other explanations of things. And ultimately, is there a general systems theory that defines all the system? No, but there are some universal kind of notions that have emerged from it. But all of those circles in that spaghetti mess basically kind of flew, or kind of like spores out of like, a plant like that came out of some
Yeah.
of that study. So some of the examples of those circles were things like network theory, which is the
Mm.
study of how networks actually function. And a network could be a network of humans, like an actual social network, not the technology version, but human version. It
Yep.
could be a computer network of like devices. It could be, a network of airports, and you have the hubs and then
Right.
the connections between airports, and understanding how they behave and how fast things flow between them. Another one of those fields is information theory, which is looking at information as if it was a physical thing following the laws of physics, which
Mm.
turns out it is. And there are all kinds of weird mind bending ways we can understand information as if it was a physical quantity exchanging, between things. And there are others, for example, dynamical systems, or other forms of systems that have different characteristics that people study in depth. So in a
Mm.
weird way, there are specialists, and
That's
there are systems people who I would say are not very cross disciplinary within systems. So that it does get meta. um, but the sort of field today that is probably the most accessible for folks looking
yeah.
for an entry is system dynamics. And that's like Jay Forrester and a lot of that world. And like Donella Meadows is a name that I'm seeing a lot of designers really worship at the cult of Donella Meadows, which I love to see because her writing is fabulous. Her
I'm
book,
I'm kind of with
Thinking
I'm
in
kind of with
Systems.
that crew of people. I do love her.
Me too. Me too. She might have
Yeah.
been, well, I was about to say she might have been my entry point too, but that's probably not true because I did learn about a lot of this in my physics degree. Kind of was where I
Mm.
meh.
Yeah.
But anyway, I think it's for good reason. She does a very, very good job of both describing how this stuff works and making it relevant to a practice like design, even though she was never writing for like human-centered designers specifically.
Little
So
did she
system
know.
dynamics is like that way of saying, okay, we could zoom out. And there what I think is helping that field is there are specific things like causal loop diagrams that
Hmm.
are a form of a diagram. In fact, I think you had a slide of one, but
Yeah, I'll pull it
there's
up as
like
you're talking.
yeah, this is something that I think designers naturally grab onto. So you don't have to worry too much about having this historical picture of all the system's subfields. Different subfields you can mix and match. I look at it like, look, these are all tools in the toolbox, and just use the ones that seem like they're going to fit the job. This is a great example of a causal loop diagram. And the key is you might look at that and go, well, that doesn't look that much different from something I'd make as a designer if I was trying to do an ecosystem map or a relationship map or something. And I'm like, correct, correct. But there are some rigorous points that if you really take a deep dive into this world, that understanding there's a reason there's little pluses and minuses, because some of these are reinforcing loops and some
Yep.
of them are not reinforcing, like limiting loops. They use positive and negative, which I also think confuses people, because a positive loop you might think is a good thing, but it's actually just a reinforcing thing. It could be reinforcing a bad thing. So,
Mm.
anywho, systems dynamics is kind of the subfield that I think is most accessible. The other one is complexity theory, or complexity science, depending on if you want to sound like a thinker or a scientist.
Yep.
And that's the study of complex adaptive systems, which are basically just a specific subset of systems that have certain traits, like emergence, which means all the parts acting together produce behavior that's different than just the sum of the parts, or self organization, the fact that the system does stuff with a goal that is not directed by one at the front or at the top.
Mm.
So, like schooling fish or murmurations of starlings, those
Mm.
flocks of birds that move in
Yeah.
beautiful shapes, right? Or, economies, social networks, again, let's not forget this isn't just animals. But
Right.
complex adaptive systems, I think, are a really special case or type of system that are really, really relevant, and for designers, but also for us in general in this whole conversation. So one of those areas that I personally am love, I love anyway from my historical studies, but just I find it is having at a moment, and more people are ready to talk about it either as metaphors to make
Mm.
sense of things, or to actually do some of the types of detailed modeling to
Yeah.
understand in a little bit more rigorous way what's happening in the system, and not just at this one point or node in the system.
And this is a map. I love that. This is a map you actually made for, what was the use case? What was this?
I, I didn't make this. I think it was an example, was it not? I
Okay,
think it
was
was
it?
from, is this the health
It was
system?
the nursing, yeah, health
Yeah,
system
yeah,
one.
because
Yeah.
there's a few that look like this. Yeah, I have to make sure there's credit somewhere in the article that I can give.
I'll
But
drop
I
the
made a
credits.
million of these. But basically, this is a causal loop diagram of, like, I guess I'll just say the healthcare system. And
Yep.
this was part of something that I was writing about wicked problems for nurses and teachers and how they're related in their roles. But if you imagine, for example, just take really quickly the nursing shortage crisis, right?
Yeah.
We can look at that in a really linear way. We say, well, there's not enough nurses. There's not enough of them in the pipeline. We need to get more of them in the pipeline. And the ones who are leaving, we got to figure out how to retain them. And it becomes such a linear sort of reductionist piece by piece. Like, how do we keep the current talent? Well, we just focus on that and we increase whatever incentives, benefits, blah, blah, blah. How do we get more in the pipeline? We recruit more. But the same thing continues to happen, is that they move through the system, they get burnt out because there are systemic things that have to do with the way that they accomplish their work, the dynamics in which their work is done, the non-tangible rewards and incentives they have for the work that they do, the respect for their craft, just like
Yep.
this broad number of things. And when you start to map those, it's way more complicated, as you can see in this picture, than just, oh, we need to like pay them some more, which we should, and give them more benefits, which we should. There's a
Yeah.
lot of other systems at our system dynamics at play. So things like this, or what system scientists sometimes call rich pictures, just lots of ways of
Yeah.
mapping. They're familiar to designers, which is why I think this is powerful. Designers are, I think, accustomed to visualizing knowledge. And what I really like, and I know I've made this point in other places and with you previously, but I'm a broken record about it. A lot of system science and all the subdisciplines within it is really doing amazingly at describing and sense making and
Mhm.
making meaning out of what we're observing. In some tiny places, it's also providing some prescriptive, or at least some kind of like, here's what we can do to change some of these systems in some way, but not a
Yeah.
lot of. I mean, Donella Meadows wrote about it a lot. A lot of system dynamics gets into it a little bit. That causal loop diagram is like a way of saying this cycle is bad, we need to interrupt it. But that's about as far as we go beyond meaning making. A lot of
Yeah.
system science truly is just like sense making and describing.
Prescriptive. Yeah.
And we need the other half, what to do. And that's where design comes in. And that's why I think design and systems just go together so beautifully, because
Mm.
designers, again, are attuned to not just understand, research, whatever, but also to take that information and guide some decision making and some change making with it. So
Yeah.
creating an intervention. We get away from words
Mm.
like solution, because in systems views, there's no final solution. There's always just, that's another common quote, right? Like today's problems were yesterday's solutions,
Hmm.
right? Like
Hmm.
thinking about the chronological system, not just so we can think about it more like interventions. And I create a number of small interventions, like wiggling part of a system, seeing what ripple effect it has, what shifts.
Mm.
And designers, that's their craft, taking knowledge, crafting an intervention to change a current system into a preferred one. Good old
Mm.
Herb Simon, right?
Yeah.
So I think the marriage of design and systems, and I'm not saying design thinking and systems thinking, because again, we know where those terms are going. But I think the marriage of those two things is very powerful, because it gets us sense making and decision making.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I know. So going back to Dana Meadows or Danella Meadows, she had said we can't control systems or figure them out, but we can dance with them, which
Yeah,
I love that quote.
everyone's
So
favorite. I love it. I love it.
so for designers going into, I feel like I'd love to maybe round out our conversation talking a little bit about how do we actually design? Is it possible to design for change, and what are some of the things you need to know or think about going into it? But before going into it, getting to know our dance partners a little bit. You'd mentioned emergence. You mentioned self-organization. Are there some basic like behaviors of systems or
Mhm.
patterns that we should be aware of going into systems design? Yeah.
Yeah, I think that like that metaphor of dancing with the system is really key. And for most designers or broadly design practitioners, I think it really starts with a dose of self-reflection and understanding how comfortable you are, not just with ambiguity, because everyone and their mom is comfortable with ambiguity, but swimming and thriving in it instead of trying to reduce it, because that's
Mm.
usually the instinct, right? It's, oh, I'm comfortable with ambiguity, and one of my skills is bringing clarity. And there's good time for that, but really, how comfortable are you actually swimming around in it and knowing that the best you can probably do is design something that will have a small change, a somewhat predictable but also somewhat unpredictable change, and then putting in place, the ability to learn from what happens. So first off is literally, you as an individual practitioner, ask yourself, how can you become more comfortable with the idea that the stuff you're putting into the world isn't a one and done solution. Now, if
Mm.
that's what puts you in design, like, no shade. If your whole reason for being in design is you want to make a thing and leave a mark on the world, I think you should own that and find out how that lives in all of this stuff. But increasingly, the role of designers in everything we're talking about is not leaving a mark. It's not making a thing and having a legacy in a product or a service.
Mm.
It's wiggling the system, putting a small intervention in that changes a part of a system, seeing what happens, and then moving forward from there iteratively. And I think for a lot of designers, that's kind of like an identity crisis. So
Yeah.
if maybe you're better off moving your work into making stuff like design shoes, no shade. But I think it's important for designers to kind of assess their own appetite for this kind of systems work. And frankly, I think the term design and designer are probably eventually going to go away for this. It just doesn't do a good job because a lot of people don't understand this definition of design anyway. So I
Yeah.
wonder sometimes if, like, we're going to start to see some other terminology for this. Service design has started to be this for some folks who are looking at service design from an ecosystem view, which is the way that I think of it, as opposed to like a more narrow, like, we design specific services.
Yeah.
But anyway, so that's one thing. Another thing I think is also getting very good at looking at the stuff you don't usually look at. So again, not just the humans, the users, or other influencers who mediate an experience, and not
Yep.
just the stuff or the touch points.
Yep.
Look at the negative spaces. If you were to literally map the experience ecosystem that you are working within, once you've mapped everything you can possibly map, the humans, the non-human actors, the stuff, data, infrastructure, you're still going to have some white space.
Yeah.
What's in there? And what's
Mm.
flowing between all those things? Get really good at identifying the invisible stuff that's flying around the thing you're actually usually looking at.
Mm.
And again, that just comes with practice and experimentation. There are a lot of good books about this, but it's really just about that kind of mapping view. And if you're a designer, you probably do a lot of mapping, but a lot of your maps might be outputs. Start using your maps as process, as the means by which you build understanding for sense making, not just delivering something.
Yeah.
Um,
I
and the
love that.
other piece I'll say is feedback loops or learning loops. An individual isn't always in a position to put in place feedback loops or learning loops across an entire organization, but it becomes a team effort. And I think being able to identify, this is where triple loop learning is really useful. I
Yep.
think you might have had a slide for that too, but I don't know if you want to pull it up. But basically, I think the idea of triple loop learning is very important and will be increasingly important. So if you're a designer, being able to dance with a complex system is going to require you to have a really strong sense of how to learn what's happening, right? In that metaphor, if your partner moves this way, you got to be able to move that way with them. You got to understand the balancing move that accompanies or follows them.
Yeah.
And how do dancers get good at dancing? They don't memorize dance steps. I mean, they do for the basic ones, but like really good dancers aren't just good because they've memorized the steps to a perfect version of a dance. They learn to sense and respond, right? There's our buzzword. Like, no longer is it a predict and plan scenario, it's a
Yeah.
sense and respond. So build up your sensing abilities, which is kind of what I
Mm.
just talked about, and build up your responding abilities. And I think the
Yeah.
responding comes from triple loop learning or double loop learning, depending on what scenarios you're talking about. It's more than just we try a thing, we see what happened, and then we adjust our actions to try again. That's sort of the first loop, right?
Yep.
Interlude there. And that's learning kind of in its most basic level. Do a thing, see what happens, adjust course, do a thing, see what happens, adjust course. Fine. But
Yeah.
then take it up a level. So that's that second loop, which is really about, are we actually doing the right things? Like, why are we taking the actions? And are the things we're even trying to achieve the right things in the first place? So what frame are we using? How are we understanding what we're doing? Like that level of thinking. That's your second loop. And it's so we do a thing, see the actions or see the results, and then we ask ourselves, are we actually aiming for the right thing? Are we using the right framing for this problem? Maybe we need to adjust our frame. Maybe we need to adjust our focus area, look in a little bit of a different part of the system. And that's your second loop. And then the third loop is that next level up, which is kind of at the highest level of what's the context in which all of this is taking place.
Mm,
And it doesn't mean you may have a lever to change the context, but it simply means you've got to be thinking about it and knowing that that's that next level where if you do have a lever to change or experiment with that, you can. If not, at least being aware of it. That's why I said earlier, triple or double, depending on where you find yourself as a designer. But as a designer, understanding that these loops
yeah.
are yours. You've got to have them. If you don't have them, what do you need to do to build them? So that you know when you try something, when you design and implement an intervention, how the hell are you going to know what the results are in that box so that you can then loop around
Mm,
and keep going. And so putting these kind of learning loops in place is really key. What does that look like, putting a learning loop in place? It might be as simple as identifying how are we going to know? Who is going to know? Where are we going to see the early signals of something emerging?
yeah.
What humans will see or behave differently? What systems will change? What are the, indicators? It's not always going to be a very quantifiable like KPI. It could be very esoteric and strange things. And this is where design is a great skill set. It gets very meta and you can start to ask, how will we know? What are the leading and lagging indicators of some of this? So you got to
I
be able
love
to
that.
dance. You got to dance with complexity. Dancing means sensing and responding. So build up your sensing skills, build up your responding skills, and trust yourself to sense and respond. And then you don't have to have a plan for everything anymore because plans
That's
are useless.
plans are used. That is great. Well, I feel like there's a couple things that like I've really taken away even just from this conversation. One is my sense is this kind of thinking requires a level of humility that feels a little intimidating. Like
Mm,
I don't necessarily know. I like to know all the things that are going to happen. I have to almost
yeah.
like sacrifice my ego and be like, well, I'm not going to be able to predict everything. It's much more of a you're like vibing with the system as opposed to commanding or controlling it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'll give you this personal story.
Mm,
I started out in physics because I felt that way too. I was a kid who loved everything, like wanted to learn everything, loved just all things learning. And physics represented the most fundamental study of everything. So that's the
mm,
like very short version of why I ended up majoring in physics. But I also loved physics and science and STEM subjects in general because they kind of represented a way of making sense of the world that I could like grasp onto and trust. Like this isn't going to change. Like Newton's laws aren't changing. I can hold on to those nice and tight.
rock solid.
And it was a bit of like I'll spare the longer details, but I taught high school physics for almost a decade and realized a little bit of the way in I liked the process of designing learning experiences, but I didn't like doing the same thing over and over again. So long story short, I found a way to design other forms of experiences, made my way to grad school twice over, and now I'm an experienced design person. But the existential crisis that I had to move through from being someone that loved science because it gave me the power to predict and not control, but at least plan, to a world where I suddenly now I can't do that. Where's my value come from as a
Yeah.
practitioner, right? Like my craft, like the value I have for an employer or for the world. As I mentioned earlier, like a lot of designers want to make and leave a mark. I never
Yeah.
felt that personally, but I still felt this need to have a value, and to produce that value in a way that others can see. And so if it's not a thing or an output, then what is it? And it actually is the dancing. Like spoiler
Mm,
alert to anybody who's kind of on this like humility, like existential kind of cusp, the value becomes the ability to dance, and it's like a self-perpetuating thing. The first time I had a project or something happening within the design part of my career that I was like, well, I expect this to happen, and boy, did it not go that way. Realizing that I could kind of use my skills that I already had to respond to what I was learning instead of looking to a best practice or looking in the design handbook that we're all given when we graduate design school, whatever. Like there was no such thing. I was like, my designerly instinct
mhm.
and my collaboration with my teammates is teaching me that we can actually pick up on what's happening in front of us and respond to it. And even in small ways, that builds. So I'm glad you mentioned this because I think you're really right. And I sometimes forget, it's a blind spot for me because I am so many years into this way of thinking.
Yeah.
The humility is critical. And if you're a designer that wants to be a famous designer, this is probably not for you. But it's definitely a function of figuring out how you can be comfortable dancing, and the dancing and the sensing and the responding is what makes you a valuable designer. And the ability to do that means always maintaining a beginner mindset and being just endlessly curious, because
Mm.
that's how you're going to pick up on signals that other people miss, and picking up on those signals is how you do that sensing faster and better than your competitors, I guess if you put it that way. So
5 final questions to wrap up this conversation. It's been wonderful. I'm going to start with one for you. Is there a
okay.
framework or like what I would call a supermodel? Do you have a supermodel that you use or find yourself turning to often to help decode a situation or make sense of the world?
Yes and no. No, in that there's a million of them. And
Yep.
I have like almost a meta Voltron version of that. That's everything I've ever learned in my life. Actually,
Yeah.
maybe I should write a book that makes the meta model of all that.
Yeah.
But I guess my answer to that is that I think the model that is most effective is to know that, that old quote, like all models are wrong, but some are useful.
Yeah.
So just knowing that, having like a collection of models that when they feel like they're the one that's going to be the useful lens, you put that lens over the light and look through that lens. It's the collection of models.
Yeah.
There aren't any particular that come to like mind as far as I use them all the time, but I think for this kind of work, if folks are interested, the adaptive cycle, as I mentioned earlier, I think is just a nice, compelling metaphor,
Yep.
whether it's a model or a framework or a theory, I don't know. Um, Another I mentioned is transformative learning theory. And then
Mhm.
I mentioned triple loop learning. And actually, a lot of that stuff ties into a field of study called cybernetics, which, if you guys have never heard of, if anybody listening is like, cybernetics, isn't that weird, like crazy sci-fi stuff? I mean, it gets tied to that world a lot, but the actual origins of cybernetics are a very cross-disciplinary learning loop based study, very similar to a lot of what I've been talking about, just from a different lens. You also mentioned Dave Snowden's Cinefin or Cunefin.
Cinnamon, yeah,
What's
whatever.
it long short?
Cinnamon.
I think it's Cunevin, like in the origin language, but I hear people say it all these different ways. But it's a nice decision making framework for people who have an understanding of, is this a complex system, a complicated system, a chaotic system, and so on. So those are a couple frameworks that I do like. I don't like use them religiously. Yeah. I also
Yep.
hate the image. Do you hate the image that is accompanying
It's
this?
not,
I'm
it's
like, do you
garbage.
guys know what this looks like?
It's
So
garbage.
but
Yeah.
a lot of Dave Snowden's work, I think, in the frameworks he builds kind of around that, I think are very, very useful for
Mm,
folks. And then the other thing I'll say is it's more about metaphor in general, getting really comfortable thinking about how to use metaphors. The leverage point metaphor is really powerful and useful in systems thinking. There's
yeah.
another metaphor that's an actual thing in systems around like an attractor state, the status quo or equilibrium state that systems
Mm.
always want to refer back to. So you asked for an answer and I gave you like none, and then I gave
Th-
you like
th-
six. But
this is a
my answer
great.
is, don't ever just rely on one framework. Look at them all as like a billion different doors that go into the room, and like
Yep.
practice going through multiple doors
It's
every
ex-
time you get.
That's excellent. A couple more. Media diet. What do you
Say that
listen
again.
to? What do you listen? What's your media diet? What do you listen to? What are you reading? What's any recommendations for folks?
I read almost nothing about design and innovation. And every once in a while people want those recommendations. I'm like, I'm sorry. Um, I read everything I can about anything that becomes of interest. Like I literally just follow my curiosity.
Mm.
And this is gets woo woo, okay? But like I basically, it's like that dynamic where if you tell someone, if you start looking for quarters on the sidewalk, you'll suddenly start seeing them everywhere. Like I'm manifesting quarters or whatever. But I think the same thing happens if you let your brain guide you. So my like, what do I listen to regularly or what do I read regularly? There ain't no such thing. I am purely like right now. I am really in transformative learning theory, which I'm very familiar with from my years in education. But I'm back into that world because I'm thinking about linking it to some other things. So I'm rereading a lot of that, and suddenly I'm seeing things in the news. Oh, I see this article my friend posts. Oh, I heard this podcast episode, and
Yeah.
they all suddenly start to link. So the way that I, you know, engage with information in the world is not to have a list of like journals, or I have a million Substacks I subscribe to. Very few of them are design and innovation. They're all
Mm.
like, some are about rhetoric, some of them are about adult learning theory. Some of them are lots of systems and complexity science. The Santa Fe Institute is a
Mm.
really, really good organization for complexity if folks are interested in that. Their programming, they have some free courses on their site. They do, like online talks and things. So that's a good one. But yeah, I just follow the curiosity thread, and
I like it.
the universe manifests things that are relevant somehow. So I trust it.
That sounds a little bit like your whole just needing to be able to sense and dance with it. So you're just
Yeah,
kind of sensing into curiosity. I, I,
100%.
I relate to that and love it. An idea you're chewing on, learning about actively. It sounds like you might have answered this one, but
Yeah,
is
I think
there?
I kind
Yeah.
of did. Like right now, I'll tell you, I have a lot of different things in my brain that all relate to each other in my brain, but I know that they don't relate to each other in other people's brains. So I've been thinking a lot about like, what does that mean and how do they relate? And right now I've got an idea brewing that it's all learning. It's all learning all the way down. It's learning at the individual level, it's learning at the community level, it's learning at the system level. And I don't mean learning like gaining knowledge or facts. I mean learning like taking in information, adapting, like a more philosophical learning. And if it's learning all the way down, it's learning all the way up. It's kind of fractal in that it's self similar and it happens at different scales and it looks differently. Learning in a cybernetic system analysis is not that different from the triple loop learning I talked about, is not that different from the
Yeah.
individual learning that Mezirow talks about with transformative learning, which is not that different from post traumatic growth. These are all examples I mentioned earlier. That's why I grabbed them. But I've been
Yeah.
thinking and chewing on the nature of learning and thinking about how to kind of start to express that a little bit more outwardly. I'll probably do some writing on it, but it's
Um,
learning all the way down. If you're designing for change or
mm,
transformation of even behavior, it's learning that you're actually trying to accomplish.
it's all about learning. I think that might be the headline. Whose mind would you like to most like to get inside? If you could other mind with one person, dead or alive, is there someone you'd want to?
Oh, I wish you had like sent me this in
Yeah,
advance. I
I
would
know
have
this
prepared
is
a
the
whole
this
like
is surprise
I
attack. We're
would
gonna
have
hold you to it, and there's no one else here allowed to
I
talk
would
to. It's
have
gonna.
prepared a thesis on this.
Yeah, yeah.
I have
Who comes
like
to mind?
really, yeah, like off the cuff here. We'll go with my hot take. So one is Bucky Fuller because I've
Mm,
just been really revisiting a lot of his writing lately as well. It's stuff I've read multiple times over, but just every time I read it, like I was talking about learning in a spiral, like I'm coming back to the well and just seeing new
yeah.
things. And he was such a great example of a guy that understood the importance of a systems view, but also wanting to marry that with intention and decision making. And he was one of the originators of the concept of design science, which these days is a little maligned because it was trying to like science eyes design,
Yeah.
but I don't really think that wasn't the legacy that it was meant to have. So Bucky Fuller is one. The other would be Richard Feynman. He was a physicist,
Hmm.
and he was a good example of someone who, when I read his works as a kid, I felt seen and understood in a way I had not prior, because he's also another one of these like polymaths. He's known for being an incredible physicist, but he did and studied everything he could get his hands on. And just seeing an example of another person whose brain was wired like that was incredible. So even to this day, there are definitely things I wish that if he was alive now and I could have that conversation, I'd certainly want to learn from him about some ideas in physics that I know he started to develop and nobody ever really got their brain wrapped around.
Yeah.
I'd also like to learn how his brain processes what we are all observing in the world,
Yeah.
So
What's going on in there?
well, those are my two. I would want dinner with Feynman and Bucky Fuller.
Feynman and Fuller. That would be a fine dinner. So last one's easy. Where can people find you?
Well, so probably easiest is the Medium site is probably the right place. Go to Medium, find me on Medium and read the stuff that's there, because if you like that, then let's talk, let's hang. You can get me by email, and I don't know if this will have like links or anything with it, but it's jen@topologyinsight.com. Like email me. I don't care what it's about. If this stuff is of interest, I could talk about it all day long. So I love to hear from folks that are either learning or interested or want to call me out or say I was wrong or, tell me that I got something completely backwards. So definitely reach out, and, you can find me on LinkedIn. You can find me in all the normal places. So anywhere you can find me, feel free to find me, connect
Yeah,
with
you can
me.
track her down.
Yeah. I'm not that hard to find.
Well, this has been, I mean, Jen, I want to thank you so much for your time and the work that you're doing. And I personally appreciate what a wonderful communicator you are of really complex ideas. I've used and stolen all kinds of stuff from you. I've found it
Awesome.
this conversation. Revelatory, wonderful. Thank you for other minding with me.
My
It's been
pleasure.
great.
Yeah, absolutely my pleasure. I would do this every day if I could. I love it.
All right. Well, I'll start booking the meetings then. We'll be
Okay,
on to it
sounds good.
next. All right. Great. Well, thanks, Jen.
All right.
All right. Bye bye.